Welcome to this month's Conservation Conversations. I'm Sean O'Brien, the president and CEO of NatureServe, and we're excited to be in 2024 now, season 4 of Conservation Conversations. And I'm really excited to be kicking things off with Dr. James Hung, who is an assistant professor at the University of Oklahoma and the pollination biologist with the Oklahoma Biological Survey and Oklahoma Natural Heritage Inventory. And of course, that last thing is the part that's most important to me, because NatureServe is the hub of this natural heritage network all across the continent. And James is one of the people that we're always bragging about when we talk about how we have the world's experts in the biodiversity of our continent. And so we're going to hear a little bit more about James's expertise. So welcome to the show, James.
Thanks for having me. Super excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm really pleased to have you on the show. We met a few months ago when I was visiting Oklahoma, my first time in Oklahoma. It was really great. And it was so fun to just sort of be actually really close to an urban area, but in a natural area near the urban area, and just see the incredible diversity that was there in this little sort of grasslandy area. And one of the things we didn't talk about there, but we did see were we did talk about the things we saw, but we saw some bees and things. And subsequently, I have come to learn from listening to you in other settings, what is a bee? And I hadn't really thought about it before, but it's just so interesting because the definition of a bee was very surprising. So tell us what makes a bee?
Yeah, a bee is a group of vegetarian wasps that have switched from either hunting prey or parasitizing a host to eating pollen for their diet. And the way you can recognize a bee from a similar looking wasp is by looking for branched hairs on its body. So if you have an insect in the hand and you don't know if it's a bee or a wasp, slide it under the microscope and look for hairs on its body that have branches like a feather.
So many people will say you're crazy because I'm not putting a bee in my hand or a wasp to get that close to it. But how often can you see that without going to the microscope?
I think, especially for the larger specimens, if you look at it, and not only does it look fuzzy, but the fuzz looks velvety. That's kind of how the light scatters when it hits hair that is branched, as opposed to hair that is just kind of a solid shaft.
Yeah. So I think it's so interesting to describe them as vegetarian wasps, because there may be vegetarians, but many of those bees will still pack a punch.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So you're clearly, based on my time in the field with you and listening to you talk, passionate about pollinators. How did this come about? Did something happen where you were just like, I just love pollinators, or what was the inspiration?
Yeah, may I take you all the way back to kindergarten?
Oh, please.
So I used to tell people that I had ADHD, but I've since changed that because I still have ADHD. It's a condition that I struggle with, but I also try to use to my advantage on a daily basis in my work, in my personal life. And when you are a small child with ADHD attending pre-kindergarten level 2 in Taiwan, which is about age 3 or 4. At the time when Taiwan was still a very patriarchal, very rigid system, you get in a lot of trouble with school teachers. And my parents had to switch me to several different kindergarten classrooms to find a teacher that was okay with the way kind of I approached the world. And finally, they found a teacher who was like, hey, this kid is not, malicious. He's not being destructive because he likes breaking things. He just has too much energy and not enough stuff to apply his attention to. So she sent me outside into the schoolyard to look at insects and to report back to her on what the insects were doing, because Taiwan is a tropical country. The Tropic of Cancer runs straight through the middle, and I lived in the southern half, so in the true tropics. So there were all sorts of great insects just doing all sorts of things in our little schoolyard, even though it was a pretty urban area. So that's how I fell in love with insects. And ever since then, I've known that I wanted to grow up to be someone who studied insects for life. And so kind of just reared insects, collected them, studied them on my own, all the way into college, where I was fortunate to join a lab that focused on pollinator conservation and pollination biology. And my senior year, I wanted to do a senior thesis, but I was getting married my junior summer and I couldn't be out in the field collecting data. And fall in Hanover is not a great time to be studying insects because it got cold really fast. And they just happened to have specimens left over from a pitfall trap study. And this happened in a year where there was a significant drought in San Diego. And lots of bees actually fell into those pitfalls that were meant to catch ground-dwelling arthropods for analyzing the availability of food for breeding birds, I believe. So there were all these samples just archived there. So here's a lesson to everyone who studies entomology. If you collect a lot of stuff that you don't need, if you archive it, maybe some undergraduate student will come by and make a thesis out of it and build an entire career on the stuff that you didn't even mean to collect. So I did my senior thesis sorting bees out from those bycatch pitfall samples and just fell in love with bees. They're just tremendously beautiful animals, and as we all know, they're tremendously important ecologically. And I think I was also very fortunate to be riding that crest of the pollinator conservation kind of awareness of this conservation issue around pollinators and ecosystem services that they provide. So I've had a very fortunate career to be focusing on this very important group that's now receiving a lot of support from many different sectors of life.
Right. So you said a couple things in there I want to just reflect on. One is I often ask people about their inspiration, and it's always interesting how often it comes back to a teacher. And it's really heartening that teachers are so important to people's lives and their careers, because we need more people going into teaching and being excited about being teachers and taking pride in that role. So thank you, teachers, for inspiring James and so many of the people who've been on this program.
Yes, thank you, teachers.
Yeah. And you have children who have teachers now, and you're hoping that they get inspiring teachers as well.
Absolutely.
So you also talked about pollinators and how they're getting attention. Why do pollinators matter? What does it mean to pollinate, and how does that help nature and humanity?
Yeah. So if you're a plant, one of the biggest issues you have is, for most plant species, wherever your seed landed, that's where you are. You can't really get up and go around to find a mate. Whereas you still have this need to combine your genetic material with a partner in order to mix up your DNA. At least the majority of plant species out there do engage in this process. There are some plants that will self-fertilize or will clone themselves into seeds, but oftentimes those processes are seen as evolutionary dead ends because you basically pigeonhole yourself into kind of one set of genes, and you don't have many processes through which to diversify. So a large portion of the plants out there, in fact, I think 85% of the flowering plant species are thought to use animals to help them move their pollen from one individual to another so that they can exchange their genetic material. So to pollinate is to take this pollen, this mobile component of the plant's life cycle, and bring it to the flower, to the receptive structure of another plant, so that a seed can form from the union of two parents.
Right. So it's sort of a version of sex in a way.
Basically, that's right.
Male and female plants materials are getting brought together through the action of a third party.
That's right.
So you said 85%, and so some species are wind pollinated, so they don't depend on animals. And by animals, we know from talking to Winifred Frick from Bat Conservation International that can be bats. Mm-hmm. We also know that many birds, hummingbirds in particular, are good at pollinating, but most of the pollination is done by insects, right?
That's right. As far as we know, there are some groups of plants, like you mentioned, that have evolved specifically to be most efficiently pollinated by hummingbirds or by bats. But in our experience, most of those plants that attract these large vertebrate pollinators will still get visited and will still get serviced by insect pollinators, especially those that are very generalized. And by that, I mean just very unchoosy in terms of what kinds of plants they would go to. A lot of pollinators out there, if it has some sort of nectar, if it has pollen that they can get out of the floral structure, they'll go for it.
So bees get a lot of credit for being great pollinators, then there's other insects that are involved in pollinating. Of course, most of us are aware that butterflies and moths are part of that equation. So what else? What other insects are involved in pollinating?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not only these big, beautiful, charismatic insects like bees and butterflies. A lot of beetles are pollinators as well. In fact, it is thought that beetles were some of the original pollinators that spread pollen for ancient plants like cycads, for example. The majority of fly species out there are probably pollinators as well, because as adults, many of the species consume only liquid. Actually, in fact, as adults, all fly species consume liquid substances. And what's easier to suck than sweet nectar that plants produce? So the majority of flies out there that feed as adults will at least opportunistically land on a flower and collect nectar from them. So if we're thinking about the diversity of pollinating insects out there, the vast majority of butterfly and moth species will feed on nectar as adults. The vast majority of the order Hymenoptera, so bees, wasps, ants, the members of that order that fly, they will feed on nectar as adults, at least to fuel their own metabolic needs, and large portions of beetles and flies as well. So the number of pollinating insect species probably number up close to 1 million, based on projected diversity of undiscovered insect species out there.
Wow, that's amazing. So I want to talk about the sort of most famous pollinator out there. But first, I want to mention that recently NatureServe did a study on flower flies and their role in pollination. And people can find that on our website. It's pretty interesting reading. But so really the pollinator that steals all of the attention is actually not native to North America, right? This is the European honeybee. And we talk a lot about bees in general. And I think people conflate thinking about the bees that are native to here and live often solitary lifestyles and other things compared to the classic honeybee with the beehives that we see everywhere. So tell us a little bit about honeybees and what's going on with them.
Yeah, so honeybees, like you just mentioned, they're not native to North America, at least the species we have now. I believe there's one fossil record of this thing called Apis neararctica. I think it was just like partial fragments of an insect that's clearly a honeybee in the North American fossil record. So it's possible that we had a species here at some point, but it doesn't seem to be, super widespread in our continent. So it's probably safe to say that for millennia, we haven't had an insect like the honeybee in our continent. And it wasn't until the last few hundred years that European settlers have brought the honeybee over to here. And when we ask people to imagine a bee, I think a lot of times the insect that they picture is a honeybee, right? It's a strikingly black, yellow, brown, orange striped insect that lives in these huge colonies with hundreds of thousands of workers and one queen, and everybody works super hard to store massive amounts of food, and everybody defends the colony with great vengeance, and every worker, that stings a human will die because the stings get pulled out. But that life history really is very unique. In fact, no other bee species in North America lives a life like that. So, Sean, as you just mentioned, the majority of the North American species we have here are solitary. They generally dig a burrow in the ground by themselves or find a cavity in an old branch or on a tree trunk that's left over by some other drilling insects. And every female makes her own nest. And she usually doesn't stay around long enough to survive to see her eggs even hatch and the larvae come out. Of course, there are some exceptions to that. So bumblebees, for example, are a great example of a group where they do live in a social colony where a queen will found a nest and rear her first few offspring kind of as a hardworking single mom until these first few offspring reach adulthood, and then they can start helping out around the house, and the queen can just kind of stay home and focus on rearing more offspring.
Well, that's interesting. I did not know that about bumblebees. That's pretty cool. So we are seeing an increase in numbers of things at nurseries and at stores where you can buy these bee houses with all of these like tubes in them. And what kind of bees are those attracting?
Those are generally attracting members of the leafcutter bee family, the Megachilidae, and most members of that group will use leftover cavities in wood by different insects that drill them. And what's really cool is because they don't excavate their own house, their own nest, they have to bring in furniture from the outside. That's why they cut leaves. Some cut leaves, some use petals, some scrape fuzz from plants and weave kind of like a pillow cover style bag to put their pollen and nectar inside. And I think that's really cool that that these devices are becoming more and more available because it's really teaching people that there are different bees out there and that the everyday person can contribute in some way to the conservation of our native pollinators in a way that is not just, well, that is distinct from supporting the beekeeping industry, which is, of course, honeybees are facing all sorts of troubles, but that's really an animal husbandry and agriculture sector problem and not a conservation problem.
Right. So that's so interesting. I do love that idea, and I have a couple of bee houses at my house that I'm hoping this year will attract some residents. So that's pretty. Yeah. Thank you. So what's so interesting, because you were talking about this moment in time for pollinators, at NatureServe, we've seen a huge increase in the amount of data and information in our database on pollinators all across the country. And we've been updating their conservation status ranks. And you were talking about conservation issues. What are the biggest challenges for bees in particular when it comes to conservation?
I think the same things that threaten bees are the processes that threaten the majority of insects in terrestrial ecosystems, and that is the loss of their habitat. I think bees are potentially particularly vulnerable to some of these stressors because bees are very specialized animals. There's in any given ecosystem, at least here in North America, there's somewhere between like a fifth to a third of species that will forage only for pollen from one plant family. And some of them are even choosier than that. They'll only go to one plant genus or even one plant species. So here in Oklahoma, for example, we have these gypsum outcrops. And on there is this little plant called Nama. And I believe there are two different species of Nama here in Oklahoma. And on each of these Nama species, there is a specialist bee. And in places where the two Nama species co-occur, the bees know which one is which, and they don't go to the other one. So that's how specialized some of these bees could be. Now, if their host plants, the plants that they depend on for pollen, are wiped out from an ecosystem because of development, because of climate change, because of pollution, that bee is going with it, no question asked. Even bee species that are a little bit more generalized and would be willing to accept pollen from multiple different plant families, sometimes they're still specialized in terms of what time of the year they are active. So here, one of the earliest spring active bees is the unequal cellophane bee. It's this big, beautiful bee with striking white bands. It's one of the first pollinating insects to emerge from their winter slumber, and they really heavily depend on early blooming shrubs like redbuds, like native plums. I think they do use some of the, in fact, I know that they also use some of the ornamental plant species that also kind of bloom uncharacteristically early for this part of the world. But you can imagine that if there's a very bad year for whatever reason, maybe some unseasonable frosts or ice storm events kill a lot of these trees or shrubs that are getting ready to bloom. And I witnessed this in some of the local parks around our home. Redbud is a pretty hardy plant, but when you get conditions just right, you can kill the whole year's worth of blossoms. As these events become more and more frequent with climate change, even the bees that have a wider tolerance of different kinds of food plants from which to get their pollen, they could be in trouble if they can't shift their season of activity to accommodate a shifted blooming time of their host plants.
So that's a really interesting point. The effects of climate change on bees and other pollinators. We know we see this with birds, where birds may migrate based on different cues than the plants decide to bloom. And so you can get a mismatch of bird migration with food availability. And it sounds like this could happen with pollinators as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one of the areas that have received the most attention in terms of how bees specifically could be impacted by climate change.
Now, we've talked a lot about bees. We've talked a little bit about some other pollinators. And I want to talk to you about something very exciting that you told me about in your lab, and I got to see in person. And I'm sorry that everybody listening won't be able to necessarily see this, but you had a very exciting field day not long ago. So tell us a little bit about what happened and what you discovered.
Yeah, so here in Oklahoma, we have these two really interesting places. And one of them is Little Sahara State Park. So just by listening to the name, it evokes images of the Sahara Desert. And if you're there, you crouch low enough, it looks like the Sahara Desert. It's these giant mobile dunes with just no vegetation on them. But there's very few places like that in Oklahoma. And we got there, we're just like wowed by the landscape and went around collecting our bees. And it wasn't until we got back to the lab and processed these specimens and looked at them under the scope that I said, wow, this thing is, very interesting looking. It's keying out to a species that I've never heard of before. I logged that in my database. And then when I was reporting to my fellow heritage biologists about the things I have, I started looking up their NatureServe ranks to see, are these species that we need to request NatureServe to add to the database? Because as you know, the database is constantly growing as biologists get more and more species into their own databases. And this species showed up as being ranked GH, which is known only from historical samples or deemed possibly extinct. And I went, whoa, this is really exciting. The last time it was seen was many, many, many years ago, I think in the 1960s. And so I was like, wow, how likely is it that I've just actually rediscovered something that's deemed possibly extinct? So I sent my two specimens to some colleagues who are world authorities on North American members of the leafcutter bee genus. And they compared their specimens with and very, very, very fortuitously, these two colleagues are at the two institutions that have some of the very, very few specimens of this bee ever to be known. So they were able to compare against the material. And it came back, they came back to me and said, yes, this matches everything we know about this species. So we do have a rediscovery of a possibly or a presumed possibly extinct species on our hands. So this is my first.
And the name again of the species?
Oh, yes. This species is called Megachile parksi.
Megachile parksi.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was last seen in 1965 in Texas. At some point in the way the world works, if something hasn't been seen in a certain amount of time, when NatureServe is doing reviews of species, they go from being rare to being considered historical or extinct. And historical is sort of like this borderline case where we haven't seen it in a long time. We maybe haven't sampled hard enough to know that we can say that it's extinct, but chances are it's not out there. And you have brought something back from extinction.
Yeah, it was such a thrill to see that category on NatureServe when I looked it up. And then a second hit of excitement when my colleagues wrote back and said, yes, this matches. So
for sure. And so will you go back to Little Sahara to look and see if you can find the species again?
Absolutely. This is one of the species where, as far as I know, the description in the published literature pertains only to the female, and we only have two females. So we want to go and try to document some males for this as well. And also do a further study on exactly what host plants they might be foraging on, because this species belongs to the subgenus Megachilioides, and Megachilioides is the most species-rich group of leafcutter bees here in North America. And as far as I know, half or more of the species of Megachiloides are known only from one gender. So this is a very poorly studied, very uncommon group of bees for the most part. So the more we can learn about the biology of this very rare species, the better.
Yeah, that's very exciting. So you have two roles. You're both a professor of biology and a pollination biologist for the Natural Heritage Program and the Biological Survey. What is the difference between those two jobs, and what does it mean in terms of like, we think of professors as doing more academic work and people in natural heritage organizations more focused on conservation. So I'm a little bit interested in the sort of the differences between the two jobs and the overlap in the two jobs.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. And that's something that I personally am still trying to balance as well. And I think we're fortunate that um, the world is viewing conservation as more and more of an important priority, and that includes people in academia. And you have these conservation-focused publications, these journals that have higher and higher and higher impact factors year after year. I like to believe that a lot of the more applied conservation work that I'm doing, for example, going out and surveying what kinds of habitats are suitable for hosting which kinds of bumblebee species, for example, that this work will not only contribute to our understanding of how we preserve biodiversity for pollinators in my capacity, preserve biodiversity for our state, but also we're generating important data for understanding conservation priorities and guiding management and practice and policy going forward. So as much as I can, I'm trying to do publishable academic work while also collecting data that will be immediately applicable to conservation here in our state.
Right. That's very cool. And it's great to be able to do both and to have that. I think one of the great things that's happened in academic science and biology and ecology in particular is a recognition of and the importance of doing work that is applicable and relevant to preserving wildlife and preserving the diversity of life on Earth. And I think that that's a great change in the past 20 or 30 years. I know when I was in grad school, it wasn't really part of the thinking.
Yeah.
So one thing that we talked about once before, and I want to come back to quickly, is a lot of people are afraid of bees. They don't want to get stung, right? And for legitimate reasons, it hurts, and some people are allergic. But you would love it if more of us would take photos of bees and put those photos on iNaturalist so that you would have access to more information about all of these amazing critters out there. So tell us a little bit about how to take good pictures of bees.
Yeah. So can I take a quick step back and just, yeah. And I think one of the most exciting innovations that's helping us biologists to study conservation status and habitat use and even natural history of all the animals and plants out there is this development of these community science platforms, that's taking advantage of the innate desire of humans to belong to community and to know what they're looking at when they're out and about, and pairing that with the capacity to archive what you've seen and to have strangers on the internet come and help you with identification and building community that way. I think it's just such a cool model. And it really helps us as biologists, because one of the biggest bottlenecks is there are so few of us who are trained to do what we do. We have limited time and we can't be everywhere at once, and we can't get permits to access all the different places and habitats we want to go to. But if anybody who has a smartphone or a digital camera or film camera, if you want, can go out there and just take pictures of what you're encountering in your everyday life, who knows when someone is going to come across, a species that hasn't been seen for a long time, or a very peculiar behavior demonstrated by an organism that unlocks some sort of understanding of its natural history that biologists never had the opportunity to witness. So I'm just super excited about the fact that anybody now can be a biologist in their spare time just by contributing these records onto community science platforms like iNaturalist.
You're absolutely right. We've had a number of experiences, and we've had Scott Laurie from iNaturalist on the program, where, for instance, the range of a species was extended, which was incredibly helpful knowledge for biologists. New species or species that were thought to be extinct have been discovered through iNaturalist. And of course, eBird and eButterfly and a variety of other community science platforms are putting enormous amounts of data in the hands of conservation professionals and people who are making management plans for landscapes. And it's really fantastic and wonderful that that's out there and becoming available for people. And it's based on often on photographs.
That's right.
Bringing it back to the question of how do I take a good picture of a bee?
Yeah. So what I like to do when I see a bee on a flower is I try to approach slowly, of course. Insects don't have super acute vision, but they have very, very good motion sensing. So I think their flicker fusion rate is something like 5 times as fast as humans on average. So what that means is things that look like a blur to you, they can see individual frames, right? So the outline of my hand is not a blur to them, even when it is to myself. So they can see and diagnose movement very well. So approaching slowly is usually very helpful, especially approaching the insect directly instead of kind of obliquely, so that your outline is just getting bigger and not moving from one place to another in their field of view. So that's just kind of step one, getting close enough. And then if you have a device that has a viewfinder, so either a smartphone screen or your eyepiece on your camera, the moment you can start discerning that is an insect on a flower, I would start shooting. And I would start shooting as I get closer and closer and closer, and keep shooting until the thing leaves. So what that means is when I come home from a day of shooting, or even just a day in the park with my kids, I end up with 99% of the photos that I don't need because of all of this kind of extraneous shooting. But you never know when the thing is going to leave, and you never know if a photo that you shot at a barely discernible distance is going to be the only photo you have. And you also want to keep shooting, because unless you're an expert, it's going to be difficult to know exactly what body part you need in order to tell the insect apart from something that looks like it.
So I have 2 questions left for you. One I meant to ask earlier. So we talked about bees being vegetarian wasps, but what's the difference between a wasp and a hornet?
Ooh, okay. So wasp is the general term, I think, for all members of flying Hymenoptera. So Hymenoptera is an insect order that also includes ants. Ants are a specialized group of wingless social wasps. Bees are a specialized group of vegetarian wasps. Everything else is called a wasp. So whether they be horntails that bore through wood, or they could be tiny little parasitoids that lay their eggs inside aphids and then burst out of their body cavities like alien, or yellow jackets that form these giant nests in tree trunks and can have thousands of workers. So these are all colloquially, or I guess also, these are just all called wasps. Hornet is a special group of wasps in the family Vespidae. And as far as I know, they are native to the Old World, to Europe, Asia, Africa, with the majority of species being found in Asia. But the European hornet, Vespa crabro, is present in large parts of the eastern half of North America, and I don't know that we can remove it. Other than those, the only insect in North America that is called a hornet is actually a very large and chunky member of the aerial yellow jacket family that just happens to have black and white stripes instead of black and yellow stripes. There
you go. Dispelling the myths a little bit here. So the last thing I wanted to ask you, James, is you sort of already achieved one of the great goals that one can achieve, and that is essentially bringing something back from extinction. But what would, when you're at at your retirement party in many, many decades from now, what would you like to be able to say you were able to achieve?
That's a good question. I think some of my bucket list items are to describe new species, species that are new to science. I've now participated in one such endeavor. I like to do more because I love discovering biodiversity and figuring out what these things are, because we can't start conserving individual species until we know that they exist, and it's difficult to conserve them until we know something about where they are, how they live their lives, and what kinds of threats they're under. So I think continuing my work of biodiversity discovery and kind of natural history documentation is going to be important. Um, at my retirement party, I would love to know that my research has made a difference in how people approach conservation here, boots on the ground. So, more broad understanding that, for example, save the bees means two different things, one in the animal husbandry world and one in the biodiversity conservation world. And these two different needs are both important, but they're achieved through very, very different mechanisms. And hopefully more and more people will choose to also pay attention to the conservation of native biodiversity that may or may not have anything to do with how much their almond milk will cost them. And yeah, I think just leaving behind a world where everyone knows about, loves, and appreciates our pollinators is definitely a big bucket list item of mine.
Well, those are great goals. You've done a couple things for me here today. One is giving me this filter of thinking about the honeybee problem as an animal husbandry issue. I love that thought, and I'm looking forward to talking about that with people who talk about that as this huge problem that we're having, because it's very different than the biodiversity crisis. We talked about the species that you rediscovered, but we did not talk about the species that you just straight up discovered, and how exciting that is, because that's, as we talk about the sixth extinction and the challenge that we're facing, you've just put one into the plus column by not just the rediscovered species, but a new species to science.
But one of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of discovering these species as well is, on paper, I'm creating more problems than I'm solving by discovering new species, because now we have all these other targets to think about. And if a species hasn't yet been discovered and described in the 21st century, chances are that they were already rare to start with. Yes. They may already have a very restricted range. So my guess is that disproportionately, some of these new species are going to be already kind of creeping towards the needs conservation attention yesterday kind of species. So,
well, James, we've been talking for close to an hour now, so I want to thank you for being on the show with us, and thank you for the work that you're doing. I think it's super, super important.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for your support of our work, NatureServe. We can't do what we're doing without this coordination that you guys provide. So we as heritage biologists are grateful to be part of this system.
Awesome. Thank you. And thanks to all of our listeners for listening to the first episode of 2024 with Dr. James Hung. You can find James's work on hungpollinatorlab.weebly.com, or you might just Google James Hung and Oklahoma and pollinator. I think you would probably find his work. And we encourage you to do that, and also to come to the NatureServe website, and where you can read about other work being done on pollinators and at NatureServe and across the NatureServe network. And as always, we appreciate you listening. And if you're so inclined, giving us a positive review on whatever podcasting platform you prefer to listen on. And remember that NatureServe is a nonprofit organization, and we depend on the support of the great people out there who are listening and caring about the biodiversity of our planet. So please consider making a donation to support NatureServe. So thanks again for listening, and thank you, James. I look forward to getting out in the field with you again soon.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks again for having me. Take care.